welcome to the June 13th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, as this is our Belmont Stakes weekend recap edition of the Pacecast as we look back at the Belmont Stakes Racing Festival, of course, recapping the final leg of the Triple Crown as well as all of the other stakes action that took place on this packed weekend of racing at Belmont Park. Supposed to get in most of the racing Thursday through Saturday, but had to move some of those Thursday stakes to Sunday, just given the air quality situation in the New York City area. I think a lot of people are aware of that. So a delay in some of the stakes events, but that Saturday card, it did stay intact. And we really saw some amazing performances from stars to competitive races. Many of them won by the favorite, so maybe not the most compelling day of racing from a payout standpoint for the bettors, but still we saw some star power, some really nice performances across the Grade 1 action on Saturday, culminating with that upset victory by Arcangelo in the Belmont Stakes. We'll also talk about some racing from other venues once we get past all of these Belmont Stakes events. Ellis Park began their meet this past week. We'll talk about some of the stakes from there, as well as a big performance from another 3-year-old, Santa Anita, and then we'll talk about a maiden race that got a nice speed figure from Monmouth at the end of the show. But Craig, the focus of the vast majority of this podcast is on Belmont Park, because there was just so much top-level racing there and a lot to dissect from this past weekend.
I know we mentioned on the forecast, we kind of look at it as a mid-season Breeders' Cup, and it certainly didn't disappoint. I mentioned how excited I would be to make the speed figures, and we can talk about that a little as we go through, because it wasn't as easy as I like it to be so on a big day. But without a doubt, we saw some really top-level performances, and if this were a Breeders' Cup, I don't think anybody would have been disappointed by what we saw in the results.
Well, let's kind of go through that Saturday card and talk about all of the stakes action on Saturday in reverse chronological order. And of course, we'll begin with the Belmont Stakes, the feature race. Craig, first of all, great pick by you with Arcangelo, really respecting this horse's improved form in that maiden race, and the Peter Pan proved to be the right call, as he had no problem handling the 1.5-mile distance of the Belmont Stakes, and just really thrilling to see another feel-good story come out of the Triple Crown, sort of following up that Derby win by Mage with connections that aren't often on that stage, and kind of a similar situation here with Arcangelo. A lot of connections that a lot of racing fans aren't even familiar with in the spotlight with this horse.
Yeah, it was a fun story, and including Javier Castellano, who was able to win the Belmont Stakes, which I believe he hadn't done before either. He now has all the three big races. And just a really good effort by Arcangelo. Continued that forward progression, as you say. He wound up with a 120 TimeformUS speed figure, which was better than the Preakness, a little bit below what we saw from the Derby winner, but just a really good race, a good effort. I thought it was a great ride, too. I mean, I've already mentioned the rider, but he was really the only guy that bothered to save ground. And it really paid off in the end, because it looked like Forte and even a little bit Tapit Trace were getting to him. But when he cut the corner and just kind of opened up, it was too late for the others to make up ground. It's always going to be a little tougher at the 1.5 miles, as the horses are obviously a little more tired than they are at shorter distances. So I want to give full credit to the all the connections. The trainer, obviously being the first female trainer, Jenny Antonucci, to win a Triple Crown race, and the rider for just a fabulous ride again, as we saw in the Derby too.
Yeah, I mean, watching that clip from the Fox show, Jenna Antonucci rooting the horse home, it's sort of hard not to get emotional, because you could see how much it meant to her, and it's sort of similar to the Mage situation, where it's connections that haven't really been in that situation before, but it's even beyond that, because you could tell that she was very aware of the moment and how historic it was to be the first woman, not just to win a Belmont Stakes, but to win any Triple Crown race. And I mean, it's sort of mind-boggling that it's 2023 and that's even the situation. 30 years after Julie Crone became the first female jockey to win a Belmont Stakes, and you sort of think about jockeys having arguably even more to overcome than trainers with this notion that men are stronger than women and it's an athletic sport. But I mean, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that a female trainer just would get so few opportunities to be in this situation for Jenna Antonucci to be the first one to accomplish it. And you could see that she really embraced that moment and sort of recognized the importance of it. And just watching her and the connections root that horse home, I mean, it sort of brings up that frog in your throat, because this sport can make you feel something at times. And, when you cover it day in and day out, we can sort of get jaded to the results and seeing the same connections win over and over again. And, there's just something special about seeing people experience that for the first time, because it brings you back to when you first felt something that deep about this sport. And it was just really cool. After this Belmont Stakes, it's hard not to be a fan of this horse. It's hard not to root for the connections. So all of that was really great to see. And as you said, with the actual performance, Javier Castellano gave this horse a great ride. I echo those sentiments. And the horse clearly came through with another big effort. It just showed that big speed figure he earned at Gulfstream 2 back was no fluke at all, as he has validated that in subsequent performances. And, Craig, we're going to talk about it more as we go through this podcast. I know that there wasn't that much excitement about this being the best crop of 3-year-olds heading into the Triple Crown and kind of through it, especially after the Breeders' Cup. But we saw quite a few performances this week, even, with the Belmont Stakes and beyond the Belmont Stakes, that are setting up a really interesting second half of the season, including for Javier Castellano, who has a bit of a decision to make now that he's got 2 of the top prospects as his mounts.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting decision for him for sure to see which way he goes. I don't know which way I'd go if it were me. It will be a tough call, but there's just a lot of really good 3-year-olds out there. Maybe none of them are great, but they're really good. And what I found interesting about this Triple Crown, if we look at the 3 horses that won the races, if you went back to early March, I doubt any of those 3 winners were on anyone's radar for any of these races. So just shows how crazy 3-year-old racing can be, and how it's just constantly in flux as these horses mature and advance, and some do, some don't. And just kind of a learning lesson for people handicapping that these horses are constantly changing.
Craig, let's talk about some of the also-rans in this Belmont Stakes, including the 2 Todd Pletcher trainees who finished second and third. Forte, as we talked about last week, he obviously had a lot to overcome entering this Belmont Stakes off the 10-week layoff, basically being trained into the race after missing the Kentucky Derby. As far as his trip goes in the race, I didn't feel like he had any, significant adversity to overcome other than trying to go the 1.5-mile distance. But he obviously ran a nice race, and Tapit Trice also, he showed up, got the distance, just was never really in the mix to win the race. What did you make of those 2?
I thought they ran fine. It's just kind of what we've seen before, where Forte, you just kind of have to ride him. He seemed to almost be dropping out of it. I was watching on Fox, and Tom Durkin was calling the race, and he kind of thought Forte was losing contact, and I can't blame him for that. It looked like he was packing it in, but Irad Ortiz just stayed with him and just kept urging him on, and he was game to the wire to hold on for second. Unfortunately for me, I may have retired had Tapit Trace got second. I did well on the race, but not as well if Tapit Trace had run second. And it looked for all the money like he was going to be second when they were coming through the lane to me, and he just couldn't quite get there. So Forte is usually game self. He certainly didn't lose anything in my eyes in defeat, trying the 1.5 miles off of a pretty an unplanned layoff, to say the least, without a race since the Florida Derby. So big effort from him. Tapit Trace, I'm a little less optimistic going forward, because I think if he was going to show his best stuff, it was going to be at this 1.5 mile distance, and he still showed a lot of the traits that get him in trouble.
Yeah, and I think the class of Forte really came through with that performance, because I agree, he was not traveling well coming to the quarter pole, and he just found a little more once Irad really got into him in the stretch and was able to just get up for second. Obviously never a serious threat to the winner. And Tapit Trice, I mean, he got the 1.5 miles. He's just not the fastest horse, and he's pretty one-paced, broke slowly again, so all of the concerns we had about Tapit Trice sort of came to fruition in this race and just couldn't couldn't quite get the job done. The Brad Cox pair of Angel of Empire and Hit Show, they were also right there at the end of the race. They both ran fine, but didn't do anything exceptional in this performance. What I will say, Craig, is that the speed figure for the Kentucky Derby that I know that I had a few doubts about, I think was validated in this race because some ran faster, some ran slower, but generally, this Belmont, it earned a nice speed figure, 120 for Arcangelo, and, numbers in the high one teens for those that finished right in behind him, and that's basically in line with what we saw from these horses in the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, I think pace had something to do with that. When you get a fast pace, you're going to get a faster time 9 times out of 10. Because, anybody's done any running knows you're not going to run a fast time. Like if you run a mile, you can't walk the first quarter mile and run a fast time. So pace does have an influence on that. And I want to say the pace projector did a good job. I know I put that out basically the instant it came out this year for the Belmont, and it's a great thing because it always generates a lot of talk and people have their opinions. And this is a case where the pace projector was pretty much spot on with this race, not only being fast, but where the horses would be positioned. And I think it paid off from a handicapping perspective.
Let's move on to some of the stakes action on that Belmont Stakes undercard. Right before the Belmont Stakes, they ran the Grade 1 Manhattan on the turf, going the 1.25 mile distance. And Craig, I think we can say at this point that Up to the Mark is the best North American-based turf horse. Full stop. I mean, he basically solidified that status here as he put forth another dominant victory. I don't know if he's facing the best group of U.S. turf horses that we've ever seen, but he's beating what's out there, and he's doing so in decisive fashion.
He is for sure, and he proved the extra distance wasn't a problem, stretching out an extra furlong. Pretty sure it seems like we've been talking about this horse for a long time now since he moved the turf because he's done nothing but run good races. He had a bit of an excuse the one time he lost in that Maker's Mark, and he's clearly the best of the division. I mean, it's not like he's just winning the races. He's winning the races easily, and he did so here as well. And the pace was fast for the Manhattan. It didn't seem to matter to him. He was up fairly close, particularly to all the horses finished in behind him, and he just blew them away. And it was actually pulling away at the wire. So it's hard to say when a weekend where we just saw tons of great performances. But if anybody wanted to tell me Up to the Mark ran the best of all the horses we saw, I really wouldn't argue with them.
Yeah, I mean, watching this horse run, it just strikes me how responsive he is to the rider. Because coming around the far turn, he hadn't been that far off that pace that was pretty hot, and he was moving into it alongside a long shot so high and was just kind of moving in tandem with that horse and didn't seem like he was doing anything particularly special. And when they came into the stretch, I wondered if he was going to have that kick going 1.25 miles, but as soon as Irad set him down and actually asked him for something, it's like the light bulb just went on and he kicked it into another gear and settled this race in the matter of a furlong. He had opened up on the field, and when he's asked to produce that kick, he just comes through with it no matter the distance. And that's a really great trait to have. As we kind of predicted ahead of time, Irad did place him a little closer to the pace than he's been in some of those recent starts, going shorter when he made those big moves from the back of the pack. And it's nice for this horse to have that versatility. And I saw Todd Pletcher saying after the race that this is the kind of horse, sort of like a Domestic Spending who won the Manhattan a few years ago, where they're going to have to make a decision. Is this a horse that we go towards the Breeders' Cup Mile? Is this a horse that we stretch out to the Breeders' Cup Turf? You could sort of make the argument both ways, and we'll have to see how they campaign him for the rest of the year. But over these middle distances, he is really, really good. And as you said, the pace was fast. It did sort of fall apart behind him as horses like Soldier Rising and Ottoman Fleet closed from towards the back of the pack. And I do want to give a shout out, Craig, to the pace setter in this race, Strong Quality, because I thought he ran a deceptively strong race that will sort of get lost in the conversation, but he's one that I would want to keep an eye on over these longer turf races for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I think he's good. I mean, the early pace figures were in the 160s, and he held on pretty well until just that last furlong. He kind of packed it in, and he's going to be dangerous, I think. Particularly, a lot of the races are he could go longer, but even if he cut back a little bit, I think he'd be fine. And I also wanted to give a mention for Soldier Rising, a horse who just seems to still be getting better. He's only a 5-year old. He's a gelding, so he's going to be around for a while. He really hasn't made a splash with any big wins yet in the stakes division, but I do think it's coming.
Right before the Manhattan, they ran one of the feature races alongside the Belmont Stakes on Saturday, a race that everybody looks forward to every year, the Grade 1 Metropolitan Handicap, the Met Mile. And Craig, Cody's Wish was the heavy favorite coming into this race, and he really did deliver on expectations. There were other horses in here that had run some fast speed figures that looked like they were coming into this Met in great form, but at the end of the day, it didn't matter. Cody's Wish just in another league than the competition in this field, and once he started to make that move around the far turn, you knew the race was going to be over in short order.
Yeah, that was one impressive move that he made, basically going from last to first or very near last, in almost the blink of an eye and doing it while a little bit wide on the turn and just absolutely blew by the field. Ran a 129 speed figure. Before I forget, up to the mark, got a 127, a career best. I think I forgot to mention that. But Cody's Wish, just impressive. I don't know who can beat this horse right now. He seems head and shoulders above everybody else because he did it so easily. We've talked about it before. Maybe distance is a question. The breeding certainly wouldn't seem to indicate extra distance would be a problem. And I would imagine once we get to Saratoga, we're probably going to see him try one of the mile and an eighth races. And who knows from there? But this horse looks like he can run all day. He's fast. He's versatile. I mean, it wasn't an easy trip, really. He was inside, kind of got stuck in behind horses, but once he was clear, it was lights out.
Yeah, the form that Cody's Wish is in right now, as long as Junior Alvarado can get him into the clear at some point on the far turn, he's just going to run these horses down. I mean, he did it, as you said, in the blink of an eye. For him to have a 4-length lead by the time they got to the 8th pole, given the position that he was in at the 3/8 pole, I mean, it's just amazing what he did in that quarter mile from the 3/8 to the 8th pole. And by the time they got to the finish, I mean, it was well settled. And, we did see horses making up ground as well from the back of the pack. So there was some pace on in this race to set him up a little bit. But I mean, runners like Zandon and White Abario, they just could not match the turn of foot that Cody's Wish displayed on the far turn of this race. And the 129 TimeformUS speed figure, it's right up there with the best that he's ever earned. Craig, I know you do want to talk a little bit about the speed figure making process for the dirt races on Saturday, because there were two paths you probably could have gone with regard to whether the track changed or not. But I just want to touch upon before Cody's Wish. Belmont has said in the aftermath of this race that they are going to look at targeting the Grade 1 Whitney at Saratoga. It's the time to give him a shot to go 2 turns again over a longer route distance. You'd have to find out if this is the kind of horse that could target a race like the Breeders' Cup Classic, because as we saw with Life is Good last year, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just target the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile again. We already know that he's conquered that he can do it. So given his potential value as a stallion, you want to set your sights a little bit higher, and going to the Whitney next will allow them to do that. But Craig, this is the kind of race where maybe the speed figure could have been a little higher. Some might argue that, but I totally understand the decisions that you made around the speed figure making process on Saturday.
Yeah, as I went through the card, I first what I always do is I just play the card straight and see what it shows me as far as all the figures ran. And when I did it, there were a lot of very uncomfortable speed figures in there in all of the big dirt races, and it looked pretty clear to me that the track sped up later on in the day, particularly starting with the eighth race. Had I not done that, the early races would have been just much too slow, and the later races a little too fast, including this one. And particularly when I looked at the Belmont Stakes as compared to the Brooklyn, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense to not split the variant. We'll talk about the next race later, but playing it straight, we would have had horses like National Treasure running a career best speed figure by 3 or 4 points. And it's really hard to watch the Preakness and watch the Belmont and think that horse improved. Maybe he ran the same race, and I think that's about where we landed on that, and I'm okay with it. But It just seemed pretty straightforward. The one interesting race, which we'll talk about, which was kind of the dividing line, was the race won by Clairiere, and that one was kind of a little iffy because of the slow pace. So that one could have went on either side of the dividing line. It really didn't matter because I did a pace breakout on it. But as I looked through the Timeform US charts the next day and looked at all the horses, I'm actually really comfortable with how I did today.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Craig. I think if I were looking at it, I probably would have come down on the same side as you. The speed figures in Timeform US, they make a whole lot of sense to me. I understand playing the day straight. It's not totally clear cut. A lot of times these speed figure decisions are not 100% clear cut, and it does feel like the buyer speed figure guys decided to just play the day straight. That's why we have such lofty speed figures of 109 and 112 for the races like the Woody Stevens and the Met Mile. So something to consider in their handicapping moving forward when these horses run back. But just wanted to address that before we move on. The race before the Met Mile, back on the turf course, was the Grade 1 Jaipur, 6 furlongs for the sprinters. And, Craig, both of us tried to beat Caravel, and it's proving to be a futile exercise as this mare just keeps coming through with winning efforts. And there's really nothing to knock about this performance. The pace was honest. She put away her main pace rival and held off the closers. This was a legitimate effort from a horse that I know a few of us have been reluctant to come around on, and I think it's time to just recognize she's a really good horse.
Yeah, I kind of put on Twitter, I'm done trying to beat her because she's just too good. I mean, the speed figure showed she was probably the best horse, but you had to wonder she's been getting the lead in all of her races, clear leads, not quite able to be caught. But on Saturday, she didn't even have to get the lead. She was in a tracking position from a wide post. Didn't seem to matter. She was able to overtake the leader and just hold sway to the wire, holding off two really good horses, the two horses who were my exacta box, so it was a little bit to my dismay, but she earned it. There was nothing fluky about this win. She gets a 123 for the victory. One of her best yet, if not her top. It's right there. So just a good effort by her, and the others really didn't have any excuses. I thought she was best.
Yeah, I thought both Joel Rosario and Luis Saez gave the second and third place finishers good rides. Big Invasion, he had his chance. Enough pace developed for a closer to get involved, and he was flying at the end, but Caravel was able to hold him at bay. And Casa Creed, he peeled out at the top of the stretch like he might be able to win his third Jaipur in a row, but just sort of lacked that late punch. Maybe the long layoff had something to do with that. They ran their races, just couldn't quite catch this mare who has been in excellent form as of late. She's putting together a nice little win streak here, and it's going to be interesting to see if she can continue to hold this form through the rest of the season.
Yeah, one thing I read which surprised me is apparently the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint this year is going to be at 5 furlongs, even though it's at Santa Anita. So that certainly isn't going to hurt her chances.
No, it's not. That I just actually had somebody inform me of that because I was saying something else about it. But yeah, that's interesting. Definitely is not going to hurt her at all. And those 5 furlong turf sprints at the in the Breeders' Cup, they can be quite speed favoring, and she certainly has the right running style for that. Let's move on to the Woody Stevens, a race that we had already touched upon a little bit with regard to the speed figure. And Craig, whether you have this race as extremely fast, in the high 120s or the 123 like we did give it for on the Timeform US speed figure scale, there is no doubt that the top three in this race really showed up and ran career best efforts. Arabian Lion, a horse that I had sort of been slow to come around to, just given what we had seen from him early in his career, where he looked a little faint-hearted, wasn't showing up in a couple of races. Bob Baffert's gotten him completely turned around. I guess he had shown signs of it in the Sir Barton last time, but just a new horse. I mean, he can rate now, he can finish off his races, and turning back to the 7 furlongs arguably helped him.
Yeah, that was an impressive race. He wound up with a 123 time form US speed figure from us, same as he had run in the Sir Barton. Very good effort. I think the real question with him is how far can he go? I've seen talk of maybe they're going to try the Haskell next time with him, but if they do and it doesn't work out, he certainly had some races to fall back on because this horse is a very, very good sprinter.
For sure. And I thought it was also a good effort by the runner-up, Drew's Gold, who was undefeated coming into this, traveled strongly into the race, was contesting a pace that was honest, although I will note, Craig, the pace did mostly hold together, and that's sort of contrary to what we had discussed coming into this race. But this is the one race on the Belmont Saturday card among the stakes that was really affected by scratches. The two horses that I think were shown closest up to the lead on the pace projector, New York Thunder and Harrodsburg, they both scratched out of this race. I think New York Thunder, a vet scratch, and then Harrodsburg getting loose in the paddock. And that really did take the speed out of this race that maybe could have forced it to collapse. And it did not collapse. I mean, it mostly held together. A federal judge who was leading early, he did fade to fourth. But Drew's Gold was pressing him. He went on with it at the top of the stretch, just could not withstand the late challenge of Arabian Lion. But a good effort to be second. And Gilmore just, sort of surprisingly close to the pace early, was able to stay on well enough for third. The top three all ran nice races. This race sort of reminds me of the Pat Day Mile, where we saw a number of horses make big improvements, but that number is proven to be legitimate. I think Gilmore sort of validated it here. And this is another one that just feels like, given the gaps between the horses, especially after the first three finishers, runners like General Jim and Victory Formation, who are not bad horses, losing this race by 15 and 20 lengths, it sort of makes you believe in this race earning a really high number.
Yeah, and like you said, the race did hold together despite the early pace figure being a 153 set by federal judge. But to me, that's more an indictment of the closers in this race. They just couldn't really get anything done. They had opportunity. I guess the real disappointment would be General Jim, who won that Pat Day Mile, and he just had nothing in the stretch. Was pretty disappointing as the second choice in here. So a race where I think all of the top three were legitimately pretty good, and even federal judge, considering I still think it was a pretty quick pace, and he held on okay. I mean, he got a career best speed figure, even though he was pretty well beaten back and forth.
Yeah, he probably did not appreciate the 7 furlong distance. He was sort of shutting down at the end of this race. But the top three, all really nice horses. And Bob Baffert has mentioned that the Haskell could be a target for Arabian Lion as well as Arabian Night, who we haven't talked about much lately, but had generated so much buzz at the start of Triple Crown season. Obviously haven't seen him in a while, but he's been training back. So just more 3-year-olds that are running fast races that could have a real say in the second half of the season, and it's setting up potentially a great Travers. I know we're still a couple months away from that, and it's early. All of these horses have to stay healthy, but I'll be interested to see how this all plays out over the upcoming few months. Craig, on a day when we saw a lot of the stars deliver, one of the ones that maybe had to overcome the most was Clairiere in the Grade 1 Ogden Phipps, because there was not a whole lot of pace signed on in this race. It didn't really develop on the front end. They were going slowly early. She had a lot of work to do in the final 3/8 of a mile, but this mare just knows how to win races, and she was able to get past her arch nemesis, search results.
Yeah, it might be the opposite, that search results is Clariere's search results are its nemesis.
Yes, well put.
Yeah, because she's without Clairiere around, search results would have a lot better record, and she always seems to show up and run a race, but Clairiere is just too good right now. She's in career best form. She gets a 122 time form US speed figure. It did get a bit of a pace upgrade of about 6 or 7 points. You can see the time form US final time rating of 115 in the charts, but for me, this was arguably my favorite performance of the weekend because it once again looked like she had no chance turning for home to make up all that ground, particularly when you knew that the half mile was almost a 49. That's how slow it was, but it just didn't seem to matter. Once she gets rolling, she is just like a machine coming through the lane and seems to know what the target is and always gets the job done, at least this year. She's just been fabulous.
Yeah, I was looking up the GMAX splits to see how fast she really came home, and they had her running the last quarter in 23.44 seconds. And, I'm throwing out a raw time, which always needs some context, but Belmont Park, on Saturday was not some souped up highway like we sometimes see on these big days. I mean, it was only getting a track condition rating of 6 and then 7 later in the day in TimeformUS, so it's not like the track was playing extremely fast, and she was really motoring at the end of this race to get search results on the wire, because search results, she did not shut down at the end of this race. She ran through the finish. It was a winning performance, just could not withstand the championship effort of Clairiere, who was able to win her second consecutive Grade 1 Ogden Phipps. And, some others in behind, Craig, also ran well, played hard. I think showed that her effort in the La Troyenne in the prior race was no fluke. She held decently for third, past the Champagne, just not quite good enough. I guess the big disappointment in this race was Secret Oath, who, I think we had seen some hints of it in her La Troyenne loss, that, maybe she wasn't finishing off that race the way that you wanted to. And sort of like last year, as we get into the middle portion of the season, her form was just kind of going a little bit sour.
Yeah, she was disappointing for me. She started the year off with a career best speed figure, which is a good sign for a 4-year-old, but the last two have not been good. So I'm not sure what the plan will be with her, but she's a horse as a gambling proposition that I would continue to look to beat, because with her reputation, she's always going to take some money.
We saw a few Breeders' Cup winners win on this Saturday card at Belmont, and included among them was Elite Power, who came back off the layoff to win the Grade 2 True North. This is one of the stakes that took place early in the day at Belmont Park on Saturday. And, Craig, this horse had a little bit of a pace situation to overcome here, as it really didn't develop, but some of the speeds that you would have expected to have been out winging on the front end, they just didn't run their races, and I guess it helped the race to fall apart a little bit. But Elite Power at the end of the day probably didn't need much help, because he's just in really great form right now, got the perfect prep off the layoff for whatever they're going to target in the summer.
Yeah, I was impressed by Elite Power. I was impressed by him in his Saudi race, really for the first time. I thought he kind of beat up on a weak division last year, but this one, even though it wasn't the strongest field, the way he did it to me was really impressive. He got a 122 time form US speed figure, a few points below his time form rating from the Saudi race, but this is one of those races where I would say he probably could have run faster. He was totally geared down. The way he took command of the race on the turn while wide was just, it was very impressive. So he, to me, is clearly the leader of the division once again, even against the 3-year-olds who we saw run a slightly faster speed figure. But just, I was really impressed with Elite Power. And you also have to give him credit for his versatility. He's a horse who sometimes he seemed like he might need some pace, but he's shown a new dimension where he's able to stay close when he has to. He's able to just be put wherever he needs to be and get the job done. And his leg kick is just really impressive.
Yeah, he really was never that far off the pace here, and I think that's a feather in his cap that he does not have to come from as far back as he did in that Breeders' Cup Sprint victory last year, but he does have the versatility to come from as far back as that when the pace develops on the front end. So he's just a really good horse. I would guess they're going to target a race like the Grade 1 Vanderbilt at Saratoga. 6 furlongs is as short as this horse wants to go. I mean, he's one that's probably at his best going 7 furlongs, but it just sounds like Belmont and the connections would prefer to keep him separate from Cody's Wish, and with that one potentially stretching out, they might not have to fret about that too much moving forward. It would be a little bit of a shame if we never get to see these two match up, just given how impressive each of them are and how they do have some overlap with the distances that they contest. But unless Cody's Wish really doesn't handle the stretch out and we see him back in the dirt mile, it seems unlikely that we're ever going to get these two matching up against each other. But Elite Power, a really talented sprinter who is going to be a terror in any races around one turn the rest of the year. Move on to some of the other races that were just below Grade 1 status on the Saturday card. The poker produced a little bit of an upset as the heavy favorite Chez Pierre was unable to back up his impressive victory in the Maker's Mark from Keeneland a couple months ago, and Emmanuel for the Todd Pletcher got the job done here as Todd Pletcher swept both of the routes for the older males going on the turf on Saturday at Belmont Park. And Craig, I think this was just really a factor of Chez Pierre not showing up, and that's sort of opening the race up to everybody else.
Yeah, that's exactly how it seems when you look at the speed figure. Manuel gets the win with a 119, same as the runner-up, Philo D'Ariana. Both got 119s. They did it in different ways. The runner-up was on the lead, Emmanuel was back in last. And it just seems like Shea Pierre didn't, maybe he left his race at Keeneland. Maybe he really likes Keeneland for whatever reason. He just didn't run. And Emmanuel was able to turn the tables. He had been in that race at Keeneland where Pierre was able to just demolish the field, and I had kind of written him off a little bit, thinking he just was an inferior horse, but he's pretty consistent, if anything. He basically runs right around this low 120 or high teen, low 120 speed figure every time out. So when the others don't show up, this is probably what kind of horse he is, a grade three, and Shea Pierre just didn't deliver.
Yeah, Chez Pierre is a horse that maybe benefited a little bit from the race flow in that Maker's Mark. In retrospect, going back to view that race, you could make the argument that horses like Modern Games and Up to the Mark were a little compromised by the flow that day. But regardless of all of that, he really did regress here. And I saw some people saying that he should have set the pace and got on with it once he broke sharply. He was a little keen in the early stages, but still, he was supposed to produce some kind of kick. I mean, and he would have finished fourth here if not for a little traffic trouble by Anaconda at the very end of the race. So a disappointing effort from him. And I mean, at the end of the day, this was just a grade 3 race with a grade 3 level performance by the winner, Emmanuel. Let's move on to the final graded stakes that we'll discuss from that Saturday card, the Brooklyn. This one, of course, going the Belmont Stakes distance of 1.5 miles. And next, Craig, when you let this horse get comfortable on the front end, he's going to produce a kick, and you're just not going to catch him. And his Brooklyn foes, they let him get comfortable, and there was no catching next on this day.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised he went off at the odds he did. I knew you would like him in here. I knew you liked him on Breeders' Cup weekend last year, and yeah, he's just a really good horse. I think you could excuse his comeback last time, trying to go that long of a distance off a layoff cannot be an easy thing for a horse, and he was much better, much more fit on this day, and just probably the best older horse we have going this distance. Not sure. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of races for him to show up in, but it's just one of those cases where when he's ready, he's going to run his race. The speed figures we should mention he got a 119 when these two races first happened. This one in the Belmont. The Belmont came back quite a bit faster on the clock, but speed figure wise, not so much. We already talked about why, and it just seemed this was the another race that kind of showed me that the split almost had to be done, in my opinion, because when you look through the chart, the Timeform US speed figures make a lot of sense. Had I not done that split, all of the horses in the Brooklyn would have regressed pretty substantially, outside of Calibrate, who was in a new barn and kind of expected a move up here. So, again, it's one where it just was evidence to me that the track was faster later on.
Yeah, I think that's a sound argument to make. A very different pace situation in the Brooklyn to the Belmont Stakes, but given the 1.5 mile distance, I mean, there's time to compensate for that at the end of the race. And Next did come home a little bit faster than Arcangelo did, as you would expect, given the fact that he was able to set those blue color coded fractions. So I understand why you would, split the day up like that rather than just give this race a pace upgrade, because it's kind of tough to do that 1.5 mile races when you do have those extra furlongs to make up that lost time early in the race.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I actually did want to say that myself. It's one of those things we don't do a whole lot of pace adjustment in 1.5 mile races, and it's particularly why you said because you have so much time to make it up. It's not the same as going slow in a 7 furlong or 1 mile race where you just don't have time to make up the time that you lost early on.
Well, Craig, we also saw some stakes action on Friday and Sunday at Belmont Park. There were also grade ones run on Friday as they moved some of those races for the females to the Friday card, including the grade one Acorn, which was won by Kentucky Oaks winner Pretty Mischievous. And, Craig, we do have a clear leader of this division right now, as Pretty Mischievous has won these two grade ones in a row. And finally, we're seeing these 3-year-old fillies start to record some faster speed figures as she got a respectable 118 for this Acorn Triumph.
Yeah, it was a very nice effort by her. I don't think there was anything fluky about it, and she was able to wear down. The pace was solid, but it wasn't fast. None of the fractions coded in red. She was not far. She was far back positionally, but only a few lengths back at any time. And I'm not even sure that the 1 mile and a 16th is really her best, particularly around one turn. So just a really good effort from another forward progression from her. And I'm in your camp at that. I'm glad to see the speed figures moving forward because it was pretty ugly earlier in the year, but Pretty Mischievous at least has advanced.
Yeah, and also a good effort from Dorth Vader, the other horse coming out of the Kentucky Oaks. She's one that really did seem to appreciate the turn back to a one-turn race, and she was battling back at the end of this race. Pretty Mischievous looked like she had put it away at the eighth pole, but Dorth Vader made it pretty close at the very end as she was coming back at her. Both of these fillies, as you said, probably have slight stamina limitations. I don't think either one of these are going to be well suited to a race like the Alabama at Saratoga per se. But this acorn around one turn allowed them both to shine. And I guess the disappointment of this race would have been Money's Gold, who was sent off as the favorite over Pretty Mischievous. But I think we got the answer, Craig. She's just a pure sprinter, does not want to go this far.
Yeah, I was pretty baffled she was actually the favorite. I mean, not a huge favorite over Pretty Mischievous, but I'm not sure how anybody could watch that 8 bells and think another furlong was going to do her any favors. She still has that one giant speed figure sticking out a couple starts back and all those impressive early wins, but I would imagine we're not going to see her try this far anytime soon. Maybe in sprints, but even there, then I'd be a little bit hesitant to think she's going to run back to those giant numbers. He just hasn't been able to do it yet in these last couple.
Well, we saw a really impressive male turf horse at Belmont on Saturday and up to the mark, and we saw a similarly dominant performance from the leader of the female division on Friday, as in Italian really never let anybody else have a chance in this just a game. Only four lined up to face her, and nobody really tried that hard to take her out of her best game, setting the pace through slow fractions. Sometimes you can get into some tricky territory with these heavy favorites when you attempt to back down the pace too much, because it really does turn into a sprint to the wire. But the good thing about an Italian is she's got a ton of speed, and once Arad Ortiz pushed on the gas a little bit, she had the kick to put away this field in the stretch.
Yeah, she is just impressive. She's going to be tough to beat this year, as we've seen at any distance. She's also a model of consistency. Her last five races have all been between 126 and 128 time form US speed figures. She got a 128 from this win for this win, even though the pace was a little bit on the slower side. It isn't a race where we gave a pace upgrade. This was a fast race final time wise as well.
Yeah, she just really kicked away once she was asked to go at the top of the stretch. And it's a difficult situation for Tyler Gaffalione and Spenderella and those connections, because she was really the only one that would have had the option to press, just given the running style of the horse. The others just don't possess that kind of natural speed. And they elected not to do so and to sort of turn it into a sprint to the wire. Unfortunately, you just can't outsprint an Italian. She's got way too much speed for that. But also, Spenderella's not really a speed horse, so I know they probably didn't want to take her out of her best game that way. At the end of the day, she's just probably not as good as an Italian, so maybe it didn't matter. But I saw some criticisms of Tyler Gaffalione on those connections, but it's difficult to sort of be the horse's main rival and take it to that horse trying to beat them, because maybe you're not going to finish second in that situation, and we don't always want to see these riders just riding for second. But it's easy to say that they should sacrifice themselves when you're not the owner of the horse looking to get a check out of the race.
Yeah, I didn't have any problem with that ride, and I actually think Spenderella is still going to be a very, very good filly. Obviously, she's run good speed figures. This was right there with her career best, and she really hasn't had the best trip in the last couple. And I think that day's going to come, and she'll be third off the layoff next time. And I wouldn't be surprised if she ups her speed figure 4, 5, even 6 points with the right kind of setup.
Well, Chad Brown swept both of the Grade 1 turf races for the fillies and mares on Friday, as he also took down the New York Stakes. Did send out 4 runners in this field of the 7 that were signed on to contest this race, so definitely had a leg up on the competition in that regard. But it was his market segmentation who got the job done here, and she was the most lightly raced of the Chad Brown quartet in here. Sort of an up-and-coming filly. She had won her last start at Belmont very impressively in the Bogey and showed that the added distance was not a problem in this one. She did get to set the pace on the front end, and it was an uncontested pace, but this pace wasn't quite as slow as sort of the conversation around this race afterwards on social media might have you believe.
No, the speed figures or the pace figures were pretty average, actually a little bit of a descending line, getting slower. People get thrown off looking at raw fractions when they go these longer distances. You kind of have to know what the horses usually go, and this was pretty much right there. And I know we were both impressed with her last race. We talked about the Bogey on the TimeformUS Pacecast, and both like what we saw, even though she made a big speed figure jump that day up to a 124. It seemed totally legit, and she backed it up here. And as you say, it's not a surprise she was able to win. When you get a clear lead like that, going these longer distances on the turf, it can be pretty tough to reel these horses in.
Yeah, and I loved the way that Jose Ortiz rode her because he didn't really try to back down the pace that much. He just let her open up. I mean, she had a 2 length lead on this field for much of the way, and the other connections, maybe the horses just didn't have the speed, but it was a Chad Brown stablemate that was sort of just sitting in second, not really pressuring her. So I mean, the rest of the field was sort of 4 lengths behind market segmentation for much of the way, and she was arguably tiring a little bit at the very end of this race, but the others just had too much ground to make up, especially considering the even pace that she was able to set the entire way. Able to hold on. Game effort from Didia, who was really trying hard at the end of this race to get there, just couldn't quite do it. I mean, she does love to win races, but fell just short this time. The big disappointment, obviously, was Warlike Goddess, Craig, and obviously not as slow a pace as she's been done in by before, like when she was beaten by Virginia Joy in that Flower Bowl from last year, but the 1.25 miles, trying to go wide around both turns, especially at a time when the rails were down, I think it all just worked against Warlike Goddess a little too much, and I wouldn't be too down on her after this performance, especially if she's going to stretch out again in the future, but obviously a little disappointing.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. It's not like I would totally write her off, which I saw some people doing off this effort. I definitely think there were some excuses in here. The shorter distance, as you say, she was wide. Even though the pace wasn't blue fractioned, it was a lone leader who finished the race pretty strong. So this not really her spot. I mean, I get them taking a chance in a grade one, but funny to say in racing today, that 1.25 miles just might be too short for her. And it's not like she ran terribly. She still ran a 121 speed figure, just a few points off of what we normally see in the around the 125, 126 range from her. So disappointing result, but I don't think she's any worse for the wear, and I expect her to be a force going longer.
Yeah, I actually thought Andy Serling made a really good point about her, and that's these marathon races, especially for the fillies and mares, they tend to come up a little softer than the 9 furlong and 10 furlong races in this division. You don't see the Italians running in those races or some of the horses that specialize going shorter. And when you cut back in distance for a horse like her, who's so dominant using that stamina to go 1.5 miles, and sometimes not only do these horses lack the speed, but sometimes the competition is just tougher in these shorter races. And they had to do it because 2 years in a row, she's lost out on the Eclipse Award just barely because she only has one Grade 1 victory on her schedule, just because those marathon races, they don't have the Grade 1s. They don't run the Grade 1s going that far. So, I mean, she's got to cut back if she's going to try to win an Eclipse Award, and she just wasn't quite good enough to get the job done. Let's move on to the other turf stakes that they ran going the longest distance on the Friday card. That was the 2 mile Belmont Gold Cup. This one a grade 2 event. And, Craig, I don't think we have to spend a whole lot of time on this one. As the public predicted, the Charlie Appleby Godolphin runner Siskany was just in another league than these horses. He looked like the class of the field on the way in, and he always traveled like a winner of this race. And the Americans or the North Americans that were in this field are not among the best turf horses in this division. A lot of them were just taking a shot going this longer distance, and none of them were quite up to the task of beating a rival as good as Siskany.
No, we don't have to spend much time. I gave a 122 Timeform US speed figure at this distance. That's more like a class rating for the race. And on paper, this horse looked a tower over the field. I'm almost a little embarrassed to say I took the 370, but it looked like a gift. I mean, I didn't see who could possibly hang with this horse. I think he won as easy as could be, could have won easier. No knock on the horses in behind. I thought the Gray Wizard ran really good, but it's just another class of horse when you get out to these longer distances and you have to deal with the overseas shippers.
Another race that we could probably move through pretty quickly is the Grade 3 Intercontinental, which was the final graded stakes they ran on this Friday card. I thought it was a really good ride by Jose Ortiz on Poppy Flower, who was able to sit in behind the leaders early. You know this filly has a kick, so you can just cover her up. And once he was able to get her out into the clear in the stretch, she mowed down Bubble Rock. Not the fastest speed figure for this division, but a good performance by the winner.
Yeah, it was fine. She got a 113. It wasn't like it was a fast pace. None of the fractions are coded in red, but it was fast enough that the ones in behind her got slightly higher speed figures. Bubble Rock got a 116, but yeah, this was a grade 3 in class, and that's about what it turned out to be on the track.
And we're not going to spend time on too many non-stakes events at Belmont on the Belmont Stakes Festival weekend, but I do want to mention the allowance victory by Rotney on Friday, because this is a sprinter that feels like he's really coming around. A New York bred that's been moving his way through his conditions, now his open company conditions, and another really impressive victory to win going 6 furlongs.
Yeah, he had run some fast speed figures at the end of his 3-year-old season. It was pretty early, topping it off with a 120 and a New York bred stakes at Finger Lakes. And I get that some people might kind of dismiss that speed figure out of hand because of where it was in the competition, but he's come back super strong this year. He's run a couple. This is his third straight 120 plus Timeform US speed figure. The last two. Easily done with easy wins. So he's a horse I'm not sure where he's going to show up next. He's running speed figures that will be competitive in graded stakes. He would certainly be a just tour de force in the New York bred sprint stake division. So just kind of up to the connections where they want to go with him. But the one thing that's certain is he's really fast and in top form right now.
Feels like we can always use more front-running speed horses in the sprint division these days, so I would hope his connections think about taking a shot in a stakes race pretty soon. And then moving on to Sunday at Belmont, they ran some of the stakes races that were supposed to be contested on Thursday, including the Grade 2 Wonder again. This one a prep for the Belmont Oaks, which will be run in early July. And once again, Chad Brown sent out a pretty strong hand here. He had 3 runners in the race, but it was the biggest price of that Chad Brown trio prerequisite who got the job done. And Craig, she did win in gate to wire fashion, sort of like market segmentation in the New York, but this really had to work a little harder because she was not setting soft fractions on the lead.
No, she wasn't at all. I was actually really impressed by her effort here. She was a horse who we had shown on the lead in the pace projector, even though she had never been on the lead in her prior 2 races. She was up pretty close in a fast pace last time, but this was one that got a nice 113 speed figure, and we actually knocked it down a little bit with that pace designation. There was another race run on the same course at the same distance, which had a slowish type pace. So it was a tricky speed figure conundrum, but I don't think there's any doubt she ran very well.
Yeah, I'm a fan of this horse. She had run deceptively well in her debut at Gulfstream back in April, and I thought put in a nice effort to win, going the 9 furlongs to break her maiden two back, and then built on that here. So a really nice filly coming along at the right time for the Chad Brown stable, and also a good effort from the runner-up in here, Be Your Best, who fell just short of winning. She had gone a little wide around the turn, so she arguably also had some adversity working against her in this race, but she's one who had had a couple of trips in a row, very wide in the Appalachian in her prior start, and then had gotten kind of sort of cut off in traffic in the Breeders' Cup last year. So nice to see her get some redemption, getting back to the best performances of her 2-year-old season.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that because she was the one I had a little questions about with the speed figure because it was a pretty decent jump for her, but that makes a lot of sense.
And then the other race that we should mention from this Belmont Sunday card was the Tremont Stakes for the 2-year-olds. We had a couple of 2-year-old stakes races, the first of the season in New York, run at Belmont Park on Sunday, the Astoria and the Tremont, and the difference between them in speed figures was quite stark as the Colt Gold Sweep ran much faster than any of the fillies and also much faster than any of his male competition in this race as he won by 9 lengths. And it's not often, Craig, that we see a 2-year-old in June earning a 109 TimeformUS speed figure.
No, that one was pretty eye-opening for me when I sat down to make the speed figures. But Belmont was a pretty consistent day, as it has really been this entire meet. It hasn't been many days where I've had to tinker much with the speed figures. And when you looked at the clock and you looked at the Philly race, there wasn't really an argument that he ran a fast race. And it's not like those were the only two. The other dirt races all went into the rating, and just a powerhouse performance to get that 109. I think it's really legit. Interesting way to break your maiden, but he gets the stakes win here, and I imagine on to bigger and better things at Saratoga.
Yeah, that's a good point. He had never won before coming into this, having just barely lost his debut, but that felt like a strong race at Churchill Downs, and he certainly built upon it here. And it's easy to give a high speed figure when you win by 9 lengths, and there are horses in a small field losing by 30 plus lengths. So it definitely feels like a legitimate number, and it will be interesting to see how far he wants to go. He's a son of Speightstown. There is some stamina on the bottom side, but he's obviously a very precocious horse right now. So Steve Asmussen has a good 2-year-old, at least at this early stage of the season. And Craig, before we move on to some other venues, I do kind of just want to mention, the conversation and situation happening around horse racing right now. There was all of that news reporting, especially in the mainstream media, about the horse deaths, the equine fatalities on Derby week, and the conversation around Saffie Joseph at the time. I know we talked a little bit about it in the aftermath of the Kentucky Derby, and it's just troubling to me that kind of going hand in hand with this really heartwarming story about Jenna Antonucci winning the Belmont Stakes, this story about the equine fatalities, it's persisting in the mainstream media. I know you were saying you saw some reporting about it on TV. I saw some articles about it in major news outlets, and there were for those that aren't aware of what we're referring to, there were a couple of equine fatalities in the final race at Belmont on Saturday, and then the first race at Belmont on Sunday, both from the same trainer, unfortunately. And a lot of people naturally are comparing this to the Saffie Joseph situation. I would say it's a little different because equine fatalities in terms of breakdowns are just far more common to see than unexplained, horses collapsing and dying from other reasons. So I think that's an important distinction to make, and I think that's something that keeps getting lost in the conversation around that spike in fatalities at Churchill Downs is the different sources and different reasoning behind why each of these occurred. But it's just a little troubling to see in the mainstream media, Craig, PETA and an organization like the guy from Horse Racing Wrongs just controlling this narrative, and there just being no real response or no authoritative response from the racing community because there's nobody in that position to say anything.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but we really need to get people out there that are in charge, that are running these racetracks, and get these good stories out there. And because there's plenty of them, there's tons. We saw Jen Antonucci, we have the Cody's Wish story. But even with lesser horses, I mean, we really need to get it out there how well these horses are treated for the most part. We've talked about it. We're never going to eliminate breakdowns. I feel terrible for Mark Hennig. I'm sure he must feel 100 times worse than I feel for him. He's a good, solid trainer. He doesn't have any history with this kind of thing that I'm aware of. And it's just one of those unfortunate things that I'm sure we can do better. Maybe there's a way to vet the horses even better than what we do now, and keep horses from running that are in a little bit of danger. But it's definitely troubling, as you say. As I'm sitting here, I was watching last night, I think it was the NBA game, and it came across the ESPN scroll. Nothing about the Belmont Stakes, but about two horses dying. And it's something that people in the industry need to take seriously, because we've seen what happened with some other sports where it wasn't viewed popularly by the public, and they're kind of on the fringes, or in the case of dog racing, almost completely extinct. And I know that's a huge leap from where we are now, but it has to start somewhere. So I want to see the racing authorities just step up, and particularly the racetracks, get some positive messages out there, because there are a lot of them.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it gets lost in the conversation how heartbreaking it is to lose a horse in that situation. And we know people who have lost horses through breakdowns, and even people involved in this situation this past weekend. And it's just it's you, racing owners sometimes get this rap of being callous and not caring about the horses, and often that couldn't be further from the truth. And that part of it often doesn't break through, and that's unfortunate. And there is this conversation happening now about what's the best course to take in the future. Should we move dirt racing to synthetic because the statistics are so much clearly better on synthetic? And it gets into tricky territory, because yes, that's true, but also when you read some of these stories on CNN and NBC, they're not talking about the fact that racing fatalities have decreased over the past 10 years. They're talking about one single breakdown or two breakdowns. I mean, so those statistics over time, when you're shocked by one, you're not going to care so much that you're maybe getting 2 per thousand as opposed to 3 per thousand. So I think it's difficult to just say, oh, we'll move to synthetic and promise that things get better, when you can never make the promise that you're going to get down to zero. So it's a difficult situation, and like we were kind of getting at, I just wish that there was some authority that could step in and put out statements, or just have a dialogue going that can engage in this narrative, or steer the narrative in a different direction, because nobody is telling the not just the positive stories about racing, but nobody is making the argument for racing and showing all those sides of the sport. Because what's really going to alleviate this situation is better education among the general public about how horse racing works. Because the thing that's kind of dawning on me right now is that people don't realize that breakdowns even happen, because horse racing has become such a niche sport. It's like something that it's a foreign concept to a lot of people that aren't familiar with horse racing, whereas maybe 20 and 30 years ago, that was more of an understanding in the social contract to allow racing to operate. So just wanted to bring that up, because it's a conversation that's happening, and it did happen around the Belmont Stakes this weekend. But I worry, just given some of the media coverage, that this is something we're going to be dealing with beyond the Triple Crown races.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple things, then we can move on. One, you can't try to appease PETA, because one thing to keep in mind, whether it's surface switches or whatever it is, they have one goal, and that's to get rid of horse racing. So everything you do to help them, it's just going to, it doesn't matter. It's not going to change their goal. The other thing is, I do think you mentioned the owners and the horsemen. I think the vast majority really do care for the horses, but there's been cases, and we know of them, where that's not the case. And we really need to do a better job of rooting those people out and getting them out of the game. I don't know how to do it, though. And I just say, with no central authority, it seems to be something that's difficult, but it seems like it's something that's going to have to be done.
Yeah, and to build on that and to kind of bring it full circle and get back to the racing, Craig, I really hope that this Triple Crown and seeing connections like Gustavo Delgado and Jenna Antonucci winning these big races, that it kind of broadens the horizons of some owners that, get beat by the Bafferts and the Coxes and the Pletchers one day and then just want to send more horses to them because they feel like nobody else can win races. Other trainers that really love these horses and can give the individualized care, they can win these big races too. And I hope that there's more of a diversification and then this starts a little bit of a trend. I wouldn't say that I'm hopeful for that, but I hope that we start to see that because there are a lot of good trainers that love their horses and will do a great job and be able to win these races that aren't getting those stables of good horses right now. All right, let's finish up this podcast by briefly getting back to the racing because there was some other stakes racing and top level racing taking place around the country, not at Belmont Park from this last week, including at Ellis, where they began their I don't know what they're calling it. Is it the Churchill and Ellis meet right now, or they're just at Ellis Park? But their stakes race on Sunday was the Grade 3 Matt Win, where we did see some other 3-year-olds exiting the Kentucky Derby to come back in this Grade 3 event. And I think the Kentucky Derby result was flattered a little bit by the results of this race, as Disarm was able to beat Verifying to the wire. And Disarm, obviously, one of the horses that ran well in the Kentucky Derby and validated that performance here. And then Verifying, I mean, he just had no chance given the way the pace collapsed in the Kentucky Derby. So nice to see him rebound.
Yeah, I thought this was two good efforts. Disarm and Verifying both wound up with 120 Timeform US speed figures, finishing just a half length apart. And there were some other decent horses in here too. Raise Kane was coming out of the Derby, I believe. Another one who ran fourth, kind of ran the same speed figure. So good effort. This was a little bit of a tricky speed figure day. There was a lot of rain later on in the card. Maybe you want to view it with a little bit of skepticism, but overall, I thought it was solid. And when you look at the chart, the figures make sense. So I'm good with it. And it's one where Disarm, he's a horse who just barely got in the Kentucky Derby. Seemed like, what is he doing in there? But he ran a good fourth that day, and he showed that his form is progressing forward still.
Yeah, suddenly I'm getting pretty excited for races like the Jim Dandy and the Haskell because it seems like there are a lot of potential candidates for those races and a lot of horses that haven't necessarily matched up on the racetrack yet that I'll be interested to see how they're able to stack up against each other through the summer months. And another name that could be added to that mix very soon, Craig, is a winner of a Saturday allowance race at Ellis, and that is Extra Anejo, a horse that was so impressive, breaking his maiden on debut at Keeneland last year, and obviously lost his first start off the layoff when he returned on that Derby Day undercard at Churchill Downs. But stretching out to the mile here proved to be no problem for him. Took a step forward second off the layoff, and this could be another 3-year-old that we hear some big things from later on.
Yeah, he's a horse that has a lot of potential. He ran a big speed figure again on Saturday, a 119. I was impressed to see he was able to handle the mile at that kind of weird Ellis configuration. It's like a turn and a half, almost like the Wilson shoot at Saratoga. So I was a little skeptical that maybe he would want to go longer, but he proved there wasn't much problem on Saturday.
Yeah, and he's got a big stamina pedigree on the bottom side, even though he's buying into mischief. So maybe even more distance could be suitable for him in the future. He's an exciting prospect. Moving out to Santa Anita, they did run some graded stakes this past weekend. The Grade 2 Santa Margarita, one of the features that they ran, I believe, on the Sunday card, I want to say. I'm getting my days mixed up. But the Bob Baffert trainee, Adair Manor, who has kind of taken control of this division out west right now, got the job done. Not running the kinds of speed figures that say that she's going to be competitive with the search results and Clariers of the world anytime soon, but she's better than the competition that she's meeting out west right now.
Yeah, both are races that we're going to talk about were run on Saturday. Adair Manor's come back good as a 4-year-old. She's going to get about a 115 Timeform US speed figure. My assistant just sent the worksheets back, but I haven't had time to process them, so that's my best guess. That would be near a career best for her. She's done very little wrong in her career, but she would have to take a step forward to win like grade 2 or even grade 1 races anywhere else but California. But if she sticks out at Santa Anita and Del Mar without shippers coming in, she's probably going to have the run of things.
Yeah, I was a little more interested in the implications of the other graded stakes they ran on Saturday. That was the Grade 3 honeymoon for the 3-year-old fillies going a mile and an eighth on the turf. And a shipper won this race, Jonathan Thomas, sending Selenaya out west to get the job done here. And this was a really impressive performance, Craig. I mean, the way this filly traveled so strongly through the race, and once Joe Bravo angled her into the clear on the far turn, I mean, she just opened up on this field in the blink of an eye. Again, I don't know if she was facing the strongest competition, but this is the way you want to see a horse win a graded stakes on the turf.
Yeah, I was impressed by her. She took a big step forward, up to a 108 time form US speed figure. Again, that's my estimate. I think it'll be right there in the ballpark. And this filly's done very little wrong. It kind of shows how the game has changed and something people are finally catching on to. This is a filly who was coming out of wins at the Meadowlands and Horseshoe Indianapolis, shipping out to Santa Anita for a graded stakes race, and she only went off 5-2. So she obviously has some talent. People are catching on that maybe the division's not as strong out there as it is other places. In addition to those, the places I mentioned are running some really strong races as well. And just a good filly who I wouldn't be surprised if she could ship back east and be competitive for sure.
And then the final race we'll discuss on this podcast is a maiden race from very early in the day at Monmouth on Saturday, and another 3-year-old filly on the turf. And I think maybe a pretty good one, Craig, as Chad Brown unveiled the Klarovich homebred Surge Capacity, who is a half sister to their runner Highly Motivated, who was graded stakes placed on the dirt, of course. I think a graded stakes winner at Monmouth Park on the dirt. But this one by Flintshire, and definitely a turf horse, and the right kind of attributes that you want to see in a debut, as she really finished up this race strongly.
I was impressed by what I saw, and it's not like there were no good horses in this race. Graham Motion had a filly who actually went all favored in here over the Chad Brown horse, and it was an interesting trip as well as Surge Capacity kind of broke to the lead, had to duel with a long shot, fought her off, and still was able to finish off this race really strongly. She wound up with a 115 time form US figure off a 107 final time, which that's not easy to do for a front runner. So it tells us she was really finishing strongly.
Yeah, I mean, visually watching this race, you could see that she was a little keen on the front end. There was like a four-way duel for the lead early, even though they weren't moving that fast. There was company on the front end, and she easily put those horses away. And once the runner-up Rugula came to her at the top of the stretch, Sammy Camacho got into her, and she really kicked for home. And just the way that she was, powering through the wire was really something to behold. 115 time form US speed figure. That's graded stakes quality. We'll see if she can back it up against some tougher competition in future races, but appears that Chad Brown has another pretty good 3-year-old filly on the turf that he's going to have to manage through the summer. Well, Craig, we got through a lot on this podcast. As always, on these major weekends, there is a ton of racing to discuss. And Belmont Stakes weekend, it's sort of the halfway point in the year as you gear up for the Triple Crown, and now we can sort of take a deep breath and wait for a few months until Saratoga starts. But I'm really excited for the second half of the season now, just given some of the performances that we saw this past weekend. A lot of the stars emerging, stars that are solidifying their statuses at the top of their divisions, and my appetite is wet for the divisional battles that we're going to get for the second half of the year.
Yeah, and I don't want people coming after you, David. I think we're only a month away from opening day at Saratoga, so it's going to be here before we know it. It's a lot of these horses will get plenty time off. There's still some big races to come at Belmont, but most of them in different divisions than what we've seen here recently. So we'll see some pretty good racing, but most of the big winners we talked about, I'm sure we'll see them at Saratoga. And I can't wait. And of course, with Saratoga comes Del Mar. We'll get plenty of good racing there. And just racing around the country, it gets really good this time of year. And I'm with you. I'm really excited for it because just lots of strong competition in all the divisions, even the one division I was worried about, the older horse division, we saw Cody Wish do well. The sprint division didn't look particularly strong, but that's looking different this year. So a lot of stars out there. We saw a lot of them this weekend, and we're going to continue to see them as we move through the summer.
Yeah, just less than 5 weeks until Saratoga. Now you're making me feel like I might need a nap. It comes at you fast in racing these days, but a lot to look forward to as we just laid out. And we'll be covering all of it on these podcasts throughout the rest of the year as usual. Everybody, thanks for tuning into the Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back at you with the TimeformUS forecast coming up later this week.